Cardinal Newman's name is thrown around quite a lot, especially when we're dealing with doctrinal development. Sometimes he's even used to criticize the late Pope Francis or the Second Vatican Council. But is this a fair reading of his theology? In this video, I'll try to set the record straight. Hello everyone, and welcome back. So this November 1st, something pretty exciting happened. Cardinal St. Henry Newman, a great 19th century theologian, was officially proclaimed a doctor of the Church. For me, this is a big deal because Cardinal Newman has had a huge influence in my work, especially where it pertains to doctrinal development. Since my books are apologetics books that try to show that all the doctrinal shifts that happened since the Second Vatican Council, and especially since Pope Francis, are indeed legitimate doctrinal developments. So today, I would like to spend some time talking about this amazing saint, and namely how he developed the concept of doctrinal development, pun intended. I got here one of the books that deeply inspired me during my own research, the classical Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. It's a fascinating read, though sometimes a bit dense. Cardinal Newman goes deep into church history, so it might feel a bit heavy if you're not acquainted with all his historical references. But once you get into it, it really illuminates what's going on today. The main idea behind this essay from Cardinal Newman is that he is trying to differentiate between legitimate doctrinal developments and non-legitimate ones, or corruptions of the faith. To do this, he outlines 7 notes or markers that help us identify a legitimate doctrinal development. Now, I'm not going to deal with all the 7 notes because that would make for a very heavy video. But I would like to tackle some of them because these notes have been used by some theologians and commentators to argue that some of the teachings from Pope Francis or the Second Vatican Council do not constitute legitimate doctrinal developments, but are instead corruptions of the faith. The note that they most often bring up is the 6th note, conservative action upon its past. In simple terms, this note states that a legitimate doctrinal development builds upon what came before, without contradicting or reversing earlier teachings. And so some of these critics argue that Pope Francis or Vatican II have clearly contradicted what the Church has taught before, so they cannot be authentic developments. When asked for proof that there was a contradiction, these critics will often just say that the contradiction is obvious, and then dismiss any attempts to reconcile the new teachings with the previous ones with something like Pope-splaining or something along these lines. But Newman actually warns us against seeing things in too simplistic terms. In his essay, he writes, "Though none could surpass the later Jews in its literal observance, nevertheless this did not save them from the punishments attached to the violation of it. If this be so, the literal observance is not its true and evangelical import. Now the Jews of our Lord's day did not keep this covenant, for they incurred a penalty. Yet they kept the letter of the commandment rigidly. If then adherence to the letter was no protection to the Jews, departure from the letter may be no guilt in Christians." In other words, Sticking rigidly to the letter of the law does not mean that one is acting conservatively upon one's past. To exemplify this, Newman responds to some Protestant arguments that say that Marian devotions are a corruption from the faith because they draw attention away from Christ. Newman responds that those Marian devotions actually subserve, illustrate, and protect the doctrine of our Lord's loving kindness and mediation. In other words, Mary, far from distracting from Christ, actually leads us towards Him. So these developments should not be read in a rigid or literalistic way. They are more dynamic, more mystical, if you will. And this mystical sense is precisely what Pope Francis often displayed, whether his critics agree with that or not. Another note that critics of the modern church often bring up is the first one: preservation of type. Now, before St. Newman in the 19th century, the greatest Catholic thinker on doctrinal development was a 5th century monk called St. Vincent of Lerins. And St. Vincent is often also used to criticize today's church, so I might make a video about him in the future. St. Vincent compares doctrinal development to the growth of a living being. A baby animal develops into an adult animal of its own kind. So a human baby will develop into a human adult, never into, let's say, a giraffe. And this is what preservation of type means: a continuity in identity even if there is growth. So critics of Francis or Vatican II will say, yes, development can occur, but always in the same direction. Just like a baby arm will grow into an adult arm, but never into a leg. But we know that development, even biological development, is more complex than that. For example, pro-choicers will usually point at an embryo or even a zygote and say, oh, this doesn't look human at all. And pro-lifers will rightfully say that it is human. It is the same human as the adult, albeit in a continuous process of development. So, preservation of type does not mean that appearances necessarily stay the same. And here is where St. Newman goes beyond St. Vincent's analogy. Instead of St. Vincent's classical metaphor of a child developing into an adult, St. Newman actually uses the metaphor of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly to prove that legitimate development sometimes display great outward variation. The caterpillar and the butterfly are also in a continuous development, even though their form is completely different. As Newman writes in his essay, nay, one cause of corruption in religion is the refusal to follow the course of doctrine as it moves on, and an obstinacy in the notions of the past. An idea does not always bear about it the same external image. This circumstance, however, has no force to weaken the argument for its substantial identity, as drawn from its external sameness when such sameness remains. I actually go into much more depth about this in my book, Heresy Disguised as Tradition. In this book, I explore several historical precedents of people who thought that they were resisting corruptions of the faith by preserving tradition, but they were actually resisting legitimate doctrinal developments. and by doing so, they actually fell into heterodoxy. I also dedicate a whole chapter of this book to Newman's caterpillar butterfly analogy. And in my other book, The Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia, I dedicate a whole chapter to explaining how Pope Francis's controversial document Amoris Laetitia actually fulfills all of Cardinal Newman's 7 notes for a legitimate doctrinal development. You can find links to where you can buy these books in the video description below, as well as a link to my personal website, pedrogabrielwriter.com. Also, if you're enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe. Now, after covering the 2 notes that are more often used by the critics of Pope Francis at Vatican II, I would like to highlight one of the other notes that is not so much talked about, but that can explain much of the confusion we see nowadays. It's the 3rd note, power of assimilation. Once again, this note takes the analogy of doctrinal development as the growth of a living organism, and living organisms often grow by absorbing what is around them. This note is summed up in the common aphorism that the Church does not reject what is good and that exists outside of Catholicism. The Church usually does not reject other traditions and ideas wholesale, but rather filters them from everything that is incompatible with the faith and keeps everything that is true and beautiful in them. This note is also expressed in the classical image of the gold of Egypt. When Hebrew slaves were released from Egypt's clutches, they took with them some of the gold from their slaveholders, gold that had been used in pagan rituals. Now, afterwards, this gold was used to adorn the Ark of the Covenant, therefore turning something profane into something that actually honored God. One of the side effects of this is that sometimes it seems like the Church has capitulated to her enemies or adversaries, because the Church seems to have developed in the direction of said enemies and adversaries. But that is not a proof of corruption of the faith. According to St. Newman, it is actually a necessary note for a legitimate doctrinal development. I would like to finish by looking at the 4th note, logical sequence. This note says that development usually happens gradually, step by step. And I think that this perfectly encapsulates the principle first expounded by St. John Paul II and very much highlighted by Pope Francis of the law of gradualness. Namely, that the good is usually attained in a gradual way, one step at a time. And so we must be patient about it. As Pope Francis says, time is greater than space. But actually, reading Newman, what really struck me was how elastic and dynamic doctrinal development can be, much more than what some Catholics are willing to concede. But as I went deeper into his essay, what I noticed is that there was a constant in every single legitimate doctrinal development that St. Newman mentioned, even though that constant does not feature as one of the 7 notes. And this constant is this: every single legitimate doctrinal development that St. Newman mentions in his essay was done in communion with the living magisterium of their day. Those who tried to innovate beyond the magisterium fell into error, but so did those who rejected these magisterial developments by insisting that they were corruptions. As St. Newman said in another of his essays, In Aid of a Grammar of Assent, a man is converted to the Catholic Church from his admiration of its religious system and his disgust with Protestantism. The admiration remains, but after a time he leaves his new faith, perhaps returns to his old. The reason, if we may conjecture, may sometimes be this: he has never believed in the Church's infallibility. In her doctrinal truth he has believed, but in her infallibility, no. He was asked before he was received whether he held all that the Church taught. He replied he did, but he understood the question to mean whether he held those particular doctrines which at that time the Church in matter of fact formally taught, whereas it really meant whatever the Church then or at any future time should teach. Thus, he never had the indispensable and elementary faith of a Catholic, and was simply no subject for reception into the fold of the Church. And this is what St. Newman taught me. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe so that you will be notified whenever a new video is released. I will leave a link in the video description below to an online version of the essay on doctrinal development, as well as to my books that I mentioned throughout this video. Also, if you like this video, please consider visiting my personal website, pedrogabrielwriter.com, where you will learn more about my other books and articles. That's all for today. God bless. Let us follow doctrine as it develops, and see you soon.